what's this latest tool, Datalore, all about?
Yeah, so Datalore is a little bit of a new direction for JetBrains. So most people would know us for our locally downloaded individual use IDEs.
Mm.
Whereas Datalore was designed to overcome these problems where you need to set up data science infrastructure for teams. So in my previous job, we were doing that using Jupyter Lab, which is quite a good solution, but it does have some limits. And if you're doing it locally, it does require that you generally will have an ops team that's going to manage those resources for you. So Datalore is our own cloud-based solution, which is designed to do everything that Jupyter Hub does, but manages a lot of these things like connecting to databases, connecting to cloud buckets, getting access to resources in a much easier way. And it also allows real time collaboration. So team members can enter your notebooks and actually see everything that you've been working on up to that point. So that whole problem of being able to share results and collaborate with team members. And then in addition to that, you can pivot reports off what you've been doing. So you can basically directly from a notebook take all of the outputs, choose which ones you want, arrange them in a dashboard, and that becomes a interactive or non-interactive report that you can share with anyone. So it's this sort of like all-in-one tool that's designed to overcome these issues that you have in the research space of data science and take a lot of those annoyances that come with dealing with the ops side of things, or I don't know, data privacy and access that can come up in organizations, and just build them all into one tool.
Nice. Okay, yeah, so I understand that now. So PyCharm is this local engineering IDE.
Mm-hmm.
DataSpell is an IDE designed to be used locally by data scientists. And then Datalore is now a cloud-first tool. It's a
Yes.
collaborative Jupyter environment for teams. It's kind of like a Jupyter hub, but it doesn't require a DevOps team in order to be able to implement it.
No.
So then we've already talked in this episode a lot about um, best practices for finding and collecting and using data.
Mm.
How can Datalore help with some of these challenges?
You can probably tell from my background that a big part of my process when I start working with data is I spend a lot of time screening for these little pitfalls and traps that I talked about earlier. And I also just spend a lot of time getting to know the data, because I think I said it earlier, but I feel like before you start modeling, you should try to understand the story that your data is trying to tell you. And it won't all become obvious because obviously you have complex interactions in models, but you can get a sense of what story is going to be there.
Mhm.
And so something I really like about Datalore is out the gate, it's sort of pushing this exploration. So immediately when you load in a data frame, let's say we're working in a Python kernel, you will have several tabs which will appear when you print out the data frame. And so the first is just the raw data. But something that's really cool is you can scroll through that data with full interactivity. And we now have the ability that where you can also do exploratory stuff like sorting or filtering, and it'll actually export those
Uh,
changes that you've done to code in another cell. So
cool.
just from the start, it's prompting you to play.
Wow. So you can interact with the platform like a click and point tool, and then it
Mhm.
automatically converts that into code so that
Yeah.
it's reproducible and easily shareable with your colleagues.
It's so cool. Like the whole tool, I feel like has reproducibility and data exploration in mind. Like apart from
Mhm.
the collaborative aspects, which are also a strength, I just think it's so brilliant. And then the other kind of cool thing is, so I've told you that you have the tab with the raw data frame and the infinite scroll, but there are two other tabs which are amazing. So the first is my favorite, which is the statistics tab, obviously. So for every single field in your data frame, you'll basically get like a whole bunch of important statistics. So you'll get things like, are there outliers? What's the min? What's the max? What's the distribution? It even has a little violin plot for your continuous variables. You have the counts of the levels of the categorical variables. So, and the amount of missing data, of course, which is also important. So, at a glance, you're basically able to go, "Ooh, that doesn't look right." Like
Mhm.
that count data shouldn't have negative values, or that value seems pretty implausible. The other cool tab is a visualization tab. So, just off the data frame that you've just read in, you can do point and click and start creating visualizations to explore it.
Right.
One of those that I particularly like is a pairwise correlation chart. So you're basically able to get the strength of the relationship between every single continuous variable just at a glance.
Right.
And similarly, you can export those charts using the underlying code and you can start customizing those further.
Very cool. Yeah, I can see how this
Mm.
would make working with data frames really easy. So right now, not using Datalore, when I'm in a Jupyter notebook, I have to kind of think through, or maybe have even built up myself these functions of, okay, what are the key stats that I want to look for in any variables in my data frame, and then I
Mhm.
have to also think through like, oh yeah, so the things that I need to look for with categorical variables are different than ones with continuous variables. So you kind of have to have
Yes.
these different sets of functions that you're used to using and exploring the data with. And I think the thing that probably happens most often, and I'm guilty of this myself, is that instead of having a rigorous function library that you've built yourself, you just kind of you do it off the cuff. You're just
Yeah.
like let's look at these data. Okay, I'll look at it this way, but that doesn't have the kind of rigor that if you people at JetBrains have already spent a lot of time thinking about for a continuous variable, for a categorical variable. What are the key statistics that you should know? And then you can just go to that stats tab and have all that information right away. You don't so it it isn't like using Python. It's enormously arduous to figure out what the min and
Mhm.
the max is of a variable. But it's just something that you kind of have to remember to do. And if you don't remember to do it, you might not notice that, oh, there's negative values in here. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah, like it's not inviting. Like I love pandas, do not get me wrong. I think we all do. But it's not inviting to do it. And it also, like if you've got a big data frame, that output is so long. Like my usual workflow in like outside of data law would be literally just divide up the categorical and continuous variables and then just do a loop for the value counts for all the categorical ones. And you just end up with this ridiculous amount of output. And you're just like, oh God, like this is tedious.
Nice. So yeah, that sounds like an invaluable tool for getting those key stats. And then same kind of thing for the visualizations to just be able to go to a visualization tab. And once again, it isn't enormously arduous to grab your favorite plotting library, Matplotlib or Seaborn, and make a histogram or
Yes.
decide to do a pairwise correlation chart. But that could end up being, even with a relatively simple data set, it's gonna take a few hours to do that and
Mhm.
kind of try to think comprehensively about what all the key ways of visualizing individual variables, as well as interactions between those variables. Um, so yeah, this sounds like a brilliant tool to save a lot of time for data scientists. Sounds pretty similar to the PyCharm situation where I know that the lift that the developers at my company get is enormously greater than the cost of a license each year. And like this is a perfect example with Datalore. It sounds like you could basically offset the cost of it in a day of a
Yeah,
data
yeah.
science life. Yeah.
Yeah. It's also like because I pretty much primarily use those three tools that I talked about. When I have to go back to vanilla Jupyter without all the code completion and the built-in documentation and all these extra nice tools, it's like, how did I work this way for so long? Like you
Mhm.
just yeah.
Yep, yep, yep. That's something the code completion and the documentation references, it is so critical. I spend a lot of time using Google Colab, and
Mm,
that kind of
yes.
that code completion, it's it's really like the hover over and like bit of
Mhm.
information. Yeah, those kinds of things enormously valuable. Um, But yeah, the interesting thing about Google Colab is despite its name, it actually isn't amazing for collaborating. And then the other big thing about Google Colab is that you're stuck with whatever libraries are loaded in it at any given time. So that's like, yeah, I think that's a big difference here. Like that lack of flexibility around selecting exactly what software libraries are available in it. So
Hmm.
Google Colab is amazing for teaching. I love teaching with it because I can open up Google Colab. I can ask the students in the class to open up Google Colab, and they can either
Hmm.
upload a notebook or they can just start typing, and we're all on the same page. But the big
Yes.
downside of that is someday I'm going to get burned really bad by coming into a lecture that I'm giving with hands-on tutorials that I prepared well,
Hmm.
and they've worked for years, and they're just not going to work because a library version under the hood will have changed. And so I haven't been burned really badly by that yet, but I know it's just a matter of time. Usually
Yeah.
when that happens, I can like figure it out. I'm like, okay, there's like a warning. So let's quickly resolve this. You don't have to take like a coffee break.
Yes, yes. And it's actually, so not to kind of, you know, say that Datalore is doing everything better, but another thing that I really do love that Datalore does, because reproducibility is really important to me. I think it's a super important topic.
Mhm.
And obviously, one of the major ways in which analyses can become non reproducible is your environment. It cannot be replicated anymore. And I find some packages are so fragile. I would say particularly TensorFlow can be very fragile.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so a really nice thing about Datalore is the environment is one-to-one with a notebook, and it's completely fixed. It's fixed to the Python version, it's fixed to
Right.
all of the versions of packages you installed, and you've got complete freedom. You can install whatever you like as long as it's a Python package.
Right. That's really cool.
Mm.
Um, all right, so that gives us a really good sense of some of the collaboration features that Datalore has. Is there anything else that we haven't mentioned that's pretty critical?
I would say some other just nice little features it has. I've never seen this anywhere else, but you can actually use SQL and Python in the same notebook. So
Mm.
basically, you can have these native SQL cells and they'll have code completion and they'll have syntax
Oh, cool.
highlighting. And then as soon as you've completed that query, it'll dump out the results into a pandas data frame. So you can start using it immediately, which I really
Nice.
like because writing
That's
it
what you were going
in
to
a
do with it anyway.
string, exactly, because
Yeah.
you've probably written it as part of a connector package and you're going to
Mhm.
use pandas to read that in. What else is nice? So we have the real time collaboration, as I talked about. So that means basically, like in Google Docs, you can work in the same cell at the same time. Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
whoa.
Oh,
That's
cool.
cool.
And okay, imagine this. Imagine I just spent 5 hours training a model. You can basically come into my notebook, and because that's a Jupyter variable, you can start using my model and making predictions from it without needing to do a thing because you have
Oh,
essentially
wow.
entered the exact environment that I am currently in.
Oh, wow. That's wild. I've
Yeah,
never had an experience like that before. That sounds really cool.
it's
That'd be
really
so
fun.
amazing on a Zoom call, trying to debug some aspect or just explore some data together. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. In
Yes.
this now increasingly remote world that data
Mhm.
scientists and software developers live in, that sounds like a dream. Wow.
This is the thing. I wish I had this at my last job because we were like at home most of the time because it was still COVID days. And there were times where I needed to onboard onto a project or help out someone with an analysis. And we basically have to go and open each other's notebooks and then rerun everything. And that was an okay solution, but definitely wasn't optimal. So, the last thing I wanted to talk about is accessing to compute resources, because I think this is a real pain in the butt for most data scientists. So, pretty much the way that it's set up in Datalore is you can attach different types of machines depending on your plan. And if you like, some of those machines can be GPU machines. So that means that within the same notebook, you can basically connect to a different type of machine just with the click of a button. So instead
Mm,
to go and do some complicated setup, you can just with one click get access to GPU, and then when you don't need it, switch back to a CPU machine.
right. Very cool. Yeah, so that could come in super handy if you're training a deep learning model, like a machine vision model with convolutional neural nets, or
Yeah.
with transformer architectures and natural language processing. These kinds of model architectures are really well suited to GPUs. So you can get
Mhm.
often a 10x speed up by popping over to GPUs as opposed to relying on CPUs alone, because those
Yeah.
GPUs are adept at massively parallel, so hundreds or thousands of parallel cores doing very simple matrix algebra operations that are abundant in those kinds of models like convolutional neural networks, transformer
Mm.
architectures. So yeah, that sounds really cool. So you could be developing your model architecture while in the CPU, the typically much lower cost CPU only environment. And then you could get to a point where you're like, okay, this code runs. Now let's set some model training going, pop over to the GPU and set that running so that you're only using the GPU, the more expensive GPU when you need it.
Exactly. And it's super nice. Like it'll automatically reinstall your full environment on that GPU machine and CPU machine every time you transition. So you don't need to do a
Mm,
thing.
that does sound handy. We have a data scientist uh, on my team at Nebula that like so much of the time when I need to be like all of a sudden using GPU resources, like I'm like there will be some reason, and it's always a new reason why I can't get it to work properly, and I have to get in touch
Mhm.
with Grant and be like, Grant, what am I doing wrong? And then he always makes me feel really dumb. He's like, oh, why didn't you do this? I'm like, so
Well,
he's
if I
kind of
knew
like
how to do that, then I would have
he's,
done it.
he's like, I don't know how he's always on top of these things, but he's like our he's a data scientist on our team, but he's
Mhm.
also like our resident ML ops expert. And I
Yeah,
end up
yeah.
needing him constantly to be coming in. So like I'll get stuck late at night, my time in New York, and then have to wait till he's up in London the next day to like get the GPUs running um, in some slightly new scenario that I'm unfamiliar with.
I feel your pain. I was constantly that person asking questions at my last job.
Yeah. So yeah, it sounds really cool. So yeah, we've ended up digging a lot into Datalore features here because they
Mm.
genuinely sound super useful to me, and hopefully to a lot of our listeners. So it's like a Jupyter Hub replacement, but it doesn't require a DevOps team to implement. You get key stats on all of your variables very easily, generated automatically. Same kind of thing for visualizations. You get code completion in both Python and SQL. Um, unlike Google Colab, you can fix library versions to a specific notebook. That specific notebook and the environment you can flip uh, between the resource scales that you want pretty easily, even if that means flipping from CPU only to an environment that has a GPU, which can often be tricky in my experience.
Mhm.
And then I think the coolest thing of all, and I didn't grasp fully this aspect of what Datalore does until just now, and I'm really excited
Mhm.
about this idea, this ability to collaborate in real time with your colleagues, just like you can on a Google Doc. I think that's something that like I've become so used to with so many Google Office products is this ability
Mhm.
to just see each other and be able to work alongside each other very easily. Yeah, I mean, I'm basically remote all the time now. So
Mhm.
pre-pandemic, it was something where I just spin around in my chair and work with a data scientist on my team on this problem. But now, something like this sounds brilliant for collaborating with them. So, thank you for giving us that tour, Jody. Is there anything else that I missed that you think we need to cover that listeners need to hear about?
I don't think so. I think I've given you the highlights of the product. All I would really
Nice.
say is basically, if you want to try it, we do have a free community edition. So I would highly recommend go and register. You can play with, we obviously have some restriction on the machine types and also some of the features, but it definitely will give you a good idea of how the tool feels. And personally, I just think it's so much fun. So yeah, I would recommend giving it a go.